recording. So thank you everyone for taking the time to attend. And with that said, I should be able to, there we go. All right. The purpose of this webinar is to talk about the Section 106 and the three various MnDOT state statutes that if you've recently seen your clearance letters from MnDOT CRU, the Cultural Resources Unit, do disclose three various state statutes that you do need to be aware of. They've always been in place, but we are kind of running into some issues about who's responsible and when people are responsible. And so the intent of this presentation is to go over what Section 106 is going to cover, the federal process, and what the Minnesota state statutes and roles and responsibilities within those for specifically local entities entails. Side note real quick, there are themes within this entire presentation regarding the pictures. I guess I can do this one of two ways. I'll probably just, the easiest way is I'll just tell people what the slide picture is at the end. And if you're following along at home, you can kind of score to see if you guessed what the image is portraying as it relates to a historic property, archaeology site, or a specific private cemetery. So with that said, this one should be relatively easy. It's the Split Rock Lighthouse up in northern Minnesota. And I wanted to introduce Catherine Hahn-Schering. She's going to be our subject matter expert. She is the Cultural Resources Unit Historian and Unit Supervisor. Her team is responsible for the entire federal program when it comes to Section 106 for the state of Minnesota. That includes the trunk highway side as well as the local side. And we'll kind of get into that, and I'll let her introduce the rest of herself.
Hi everybody, Katie. Yep, I am an architectural historian with the unit. I've been with MnDOT for 7 years now, and I have a background in consulting. I came from consulting into MnDOT and have sort of just risen through project management up into the supervisor position. My specialty area, we all kind of have a specialty area. My specialty area is historic bridges. So I tend to be the person you talk to, or someone within my team would come to me with questions about historic bridges in the state. But I am also an expert in state statutes and Section 106 implementation. So it's nice to be here. Thank you. This is maybe the largest group I've ever presented to. I just need one, an even 100.
Thanks, Katie. And for those that don't know me, I'm Dale Gotti. I am SALT's Environmental Document Coordinator. I'm the one that's signing off on all your PCE documents and trying to figure out ways to resolve issues. So I deal with all of the county and city projects that are using federal funding for environmental documentation purposes. A little bit of background on me. I started my career in the city of Shakopee, so I started in municipal engineering. For those that know him, city engineer at the time was Bruce Loney. I consider him one of my early mentors in engineering. I then went to MnDOT, worked on the trunk highway side for a while, briefly went to Scott County, so I have some county experience. I was Scott County's design engineer for a little bit before returning back to MnDOT. And then, yes, I did dabble in the consulting world briefly at SRF for 2 years before returning a third time to MnDOT. And so I do have kind of perspective on most agencies, excluding federal highway. I joke that once I hit federal highway, I've hit all of the different sectors in our industry. And so then I can retire. So with that said, we will get into the meat of the presentation. So Section 106, the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, requires that any federal agency funding, permitting, licensing, or approving a project to consider historic properties within its review. The goal of the legislation and its implementation regulations commonly are known as Section 106. And the goal specifically is there to avoid minimizing harm to historic properties. When a local agency specifically proposes a project that utilizes Federal Highway Administration funding, Section 106 review is required, and MnDOT CRU conducts the Section 106 review on behalf of FHWA. MnDOT has programmatic agreements in place to act as FHWA under certain actions. One of those actions are these federal funded projects, and MnDOT CRU specifically does have that authority to do the Section 106 clearances. One thing that I want to note is that we are hopefully working towards excluding certain work types in the future. For example, pavement markings under limited circumstances may be allowed to exclude Section 106 and ESA reviews. That's a wish list item. I'm trying to free up resources to go after projects that do have more impacts. So hopefully one day we'll get to that point. I know some other states have gotten to that point, but we're hoping to free up the amount of review and staff time that Katie and SALT have allocated towards these projects, because there is quite a few. With that said, the way that these processes get initiated is a project will go to the SALT's website, download the cultural noise threatened and endangered species review request form. You will hear me at times call it an ENM form, an early notification memo. That's what it's called on the trunk highway side. I selfishly do like it. It's a shorter acronym. It's easier to say than SALT's CNTERR form. So if you hear ENM, it's the same form. It's just one's predicated towards SALT, the other's predicated towards trunk highway. And on the SALT website, we do specifically have environmental mailboxes to send to, one of which Katie's team is monitoring, which is the cultural resources email inbox. And so they will pick it up at that point and they will start their review process, which we will get into at a later time in this presentation. Any project that has any sort of federal action does require Section 106 to be reviewed. I say this because on the SALT side of the house versus the trunk highway side of the house, where I spent the bulk of my career, I am now seeing projects use EPA funds, HUD funds, FAA funds, FTA funds, and FRA funds. So FAA, Federal Aviation, Federal Transit, and Federal Railroad, in addition to housing, urban development, et cetera. It is of note that cultural resources only works on FHWA actions. That's all they have in their programmatic agreement. So if you have these other funds in your project and you have FHWA funds, we're likely to see Katie and her team, but we need to talk and we need to figure out some nuanced differences to get through the environmental document. So please contact me. I will provide my contact information at the end with the recording and the web link. If you only have those funds on your project, again, contact me, we'll work through it, but we will not likely be able to use MnDOT CRU to meet the federal environmental document regulation. I may give you additional guidance on where you can get resources to aid you in your project effort, depending upon the circumstances and what you're trying to undertake, before we kind of let you move forward with your federal action that does not include FHWA, because my role also only includes FHWA, but I don't want to leave you out in the woods as everyone's trying to do projects with all these different funding sources, because they are solving transportation issues. So with that said,
Dale,
yeah.
There is one caveat to that. If you have a core permit, a USACE core permit as part of your project, we handle that Section 106 review on behalf of the Corps under our statewide programmatic agreement. So you don't have to get a separate Section 106 evaluation done by a different federal agency. So we do have that streamlining opportunity there.
Perfect. Thank you.
Just the Corps.
And now the illustrative three different Minnesota state statutes. The first one is the Minnesota Historic Sites Act. It directs state agencies to consult with the Minnesota Historical Society if projects they undertake or fund will impact properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places and or in the State Register of Historic Places. I will say the nice thing about this statute is actually it parallels a lot of the requirements on Section 106. And so this is one where CRU will still be able to help with the clearance of many of these actions. Again, we'll get into what the clearance letters kind of detail and everything else in the process later on. But this one specifically parallels what already is a federal requirement. It just has specific lists of different resources that are impacted at a state level. The next one is the Minnesota Field Archaeology Act. This one directs state agencies to consult with the Minnesota Historical Society and the Office of the State Archaeologist when projects occurring on lands they control will impact known or suspected archaeological sites. And last but not least, and this one has become a little bit more prevalent, I can say at least 3 different projects I've run into this in the last 6 months that I'm aware of. And this one is the Minnesota Private Cemeteries Act. This directs state agencies to cooperate with the Office of Archaeologist and Indian Affairs Council when known or suspected burial grounds may be affected by agency activities. Also requires agencies to submit construction and development plans to the Office of the State Archaeologist for review when human burials are known and suspected to exist within a project area. And then this picture is the lift bridge up in Duluth, for those that recognize it, another easy kind of low-hanging fruit one. And with that said, I'm going to transition to the more subject matter expert oriented part of the presentation to Katie.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to walk through these statutes individually, talk a little bit about each of them, how it applies to each of you. Dale, do you want to tell everybody where this one is at? Because this is a great one.
So this one everyone should be aware of. It's the State House at the Capitol.
Excellent. Okay, so the Historic Sites Act, this is Chapter 138.661 through 669, really directs state agencies, departments, agencies, and political subdivisions. And this is the key here, political subdivisions that counts as counties, cities, townships. So everyone that has sort of that local agency, what we would call local agency control over something, would need to comply with the Historic Sites Act. And it requires people carrying out funding or licensing a project to consult with the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office, the MnSHPO, when a project could affect those properties that are designated on the National Register of Historic Places. Those are those listed properties, those sites that are on the historic sites list, and those sites that are on the historic places list. So Dale has just given you a couple examples of those historic sites and places that are listed within the state register. So this act is really detailing what you need to do under state level review for anything that's listed on the National Register or as a state historic site. If you want to skip ahead to the next slide, Dale, that'd be great. So here's what you have to basically do. So if you are us, if I'm the project proposer, if MnDOT's the project proposer, we have to comply with the Historic Sites Act. If it's a local agency proposed project, you have to comply with the Historic Sites Act. And it really requires consultation with the SHPO. And it parallels Section 106 very, very closely. You're looking at a specific site area. You are determining, are there any listed National Register listed properties? Are there any state listed properties? And if they are, then you consult with the SHPO. If none are present, then you do not need to consult with the SHPO because they don't have any purview or overview over anything else but that. If it's a property that's eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, this act does not apply. Once you start working with the State Historic Preservation Office, it's much like the Section 106 review process. They provide feedback about the undertaking and the effects to a historic property, to the listed state historic site or to the listed National Register site. And then you would work through any recommendations that the SHPO might have for that property. It might be project plan review. It might be adjusting your project plan in a certain way. If you cannot get to a place that avoids the use of the property, avoids the impact to the property, then you work on mitigation. So just like Section 106, it's a process to follow. There is no determined outcome. However, you're truly trying to work to avoid any sort of impact to those properties as much as you can, just like under Section 106. If you cannot find a way to avoid that impact, then you mitigate the impact onto it, and then you work with the State Historic Preservation Office to make that happen. If for some reason there is a dispute between your agency and the SHPO, that would then get elevated to basically the governor's office, and they would start working through a committee to help resolve the issue. So I think the big question here is, how do you know if I've got a locally listed or a state listed property or a National Register listed property? There is a wonderful website that just was launched here this winter that is called the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Inventory. It is in a link in the document that Dale will be sending out later. I don't know if Dale, if you want to pop that into the chat, you can, but it is a link to MnSHP. We call it MnSHP. We know that there are multiple other MnSHPs within the state, so not to be confused, this one is the Historic Properties Inventory. It is a portal that you can sign into and have a map that allows you to see all of those properties that are listed on the National Register, that are eligible for the National Register, and that are listed on the state historic sites list. Really great tool. Bookmark that if you can.
Yeah, real quickly, I will be providing all of these resources on that website. Also, for those that may have caught it, there should have been a Newsline article that went out for state aid that might have already had some of this. But again, I will co-locate it all on the MnDOT SALT website and then send out an email to the two mailer link city and county links that I have so that those will know when it's up and where they can access it.
Wonderful. And this lovely property here is the Charles Lindbergh House. It is one of the state listed historic properties. It's a really fun property. If you have a chance to go out and see it, do. Okay, the next state statute is the Minnesota Field Archaeology Act. This one requires state and other governmental agencies to submit project plans to the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office, MnSHPO, and the Office of the State Archaeologist. We'll often refer them as OSA, when a project could affect significant archaeological or historic sites. And we define significant archaeological sites just the way we do within Section 106. It's those properties that are eligible for listing in the National Register. So here it's a little bit different than the Historic Sites Act. This could be an eligible archaeological site that you need to be aware of. This act is specific to state lands, so it does not have any private land ownership, so it applies to anything that is on state lands. The funding source here isn't so much the concern, it's the land ownership. So if you are a project proposer and you own the land by which the project is occurring, you are subjected to compliance under the Minnesota Field Archaeology Act. If you're the project proposer and you happen to be working on land that is owned by the township, technically the township is responsible for the Field Archaeology Act. So just keep that in mind. Field Archaeology Act is a land ownership based state statute. What happens is you submit your plans to OSA and to the State Historic Preservation Office for review prior to advertising for bids, right? If there are any archaeological sites that are within the vicinity of your project and they're related to American Indian history or religion, OSA will then contact MIAC. Dale and I are going to make some recommendations that you can do some of this co-review at the same time between OSA and the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, and you'll hear us talk a little bit about that later. It is a 30-day review process, so keep that in mind. As soon as you submit plans, OSA has 30 days within, and SHPO have 30 days to respond. Okay, so how do you know if you have a significant archaeological site? Okay. Great. There's a separate portal that you can go to that OSA maintains. Again, we'll be providing that information to you guys, but basically it gives you a map of the state and a location of all of the known archaeological sites. There are different user levels within the OSA portal. There is just a public portal level. Everybody can see that map. It's a very high level. It will show archaeological sites on the quarter section. And then if you apply to OSA, you can apply for the next level up, which is a planner level, which is a more gradated version of that information. It allows you to see more granularly where those archaeological sites are. But it's a quarter section, so it's still a very broad area. And then the highest level is only available to licensed archaeologists. So there might be a recommendation that you hire an archaeologist to be able to see that level of data. The MnSHPO also maintains a list of listed archaeological sites within the state. That information is going to be on the OSA portal, but it has not been released yet. So if you want information about listed archaeological sites, you can also contact the MnSHPO directly to see what those properties are. Those archaeological sites are not on a map right now. They are just in files. So unlike MnSHP, where you get to see all of the standing structures, archaeology is a little bit different and held and controlled by different agencies.
And real quick, the intent behind that kind of gradation is to prevent treasure hunters essentially from going out and raiding these archaeological sites. So there are some state statute protected, levels of detail that you have to be aware of too. So don't just get the best access and then put it in your project plans or your project documentation too. So be aware of that. It's meant to be a tool to help you assess risk and avoid these things, not to televise them to everybody where they are.
That is a really, really great clarification. Thanks, Dale. All right. Picture on this screen is the Joseph Remumay's trading post site in Wadena. This is a group of archaeologists that went out and did some archaeological work within that state site. Sorry, it's really hard to say. And it's just as a chance to discover more about this particular site. Okay, next. All right, Private Cemeteries Act. Private Cemeteries Act is another state statute, 30708. It is also a landowner-based law, state statute. It applies to both state-owned lands and privately owned lands. So that's a little bit of the difference between the Field Archaeology Act and Private Cemeteries Act. It requires anyone on the public side and on the private side to submit project plans to review to OSA and MIAC when a project could affect human burials, whether they're known to exist or suspected to exist. That review process takes 45 days, so a little bit of a different review, and it has to happen before you do any kind of bidding or letting of your project. The goal of it really, just like all of these preservation-related state statutes, is to avoid harming any archaeological site, historic site, or cemetery site. In the statute, you're going to see that you have to submit to OSA, and then OSA is going to submit to MIAC for review. We recommend that that is a concurrent review, that you submit at the same time to OSA and MIAC so you can expedite your review and there's not an extra 45 days. Just a reminder, the underlying landowner is responsible for compliance with this state statute, whether it's private land ownership or public land. The OSA portal is a great place to know if you have cemeteries or burials within your project plans. That portal is not just archaeological sites, it is also burials are listed on it. And just like Dale mentioned, it's got that sort of gradation, and it's really intentional because there is a concern about going out and disturbing different burials.
One quick note, if you were to use that portal, there is a toggle between just general archaeology and MIAC areas of interest. And so they do kind of distinguish a little bit. The other thing I wanted to note really quick is this is the statute specifically where I'm at least aware several projects have started to run into some questioning specifically with MIAC about whether or not they have met their state statutory authority or responsibilities, I should say. So please be aware that there is some seriousness behind why all of a sudden we are doing this webinar, beyond just trying to educate, that there are some projects that have run afoul with some of these statutes because they didn't know they existed, to be honest. Well, we have a lot of different disciplines that we manage. And so one of them, unfortunately, is this. And I know that projects do not intend to go out and disturb burial sites, but unfortunately they do exist out there and they have been interacted with.
And there are provisions within the state statute that provide direction for if you do disturb a burial. What do you need to do? What are your next steps? So take a look at the statute and review it and know what your responsibilities are if you're working on a construction site and do disturb something. This is Fort Snelling Cemetery. Okay, so what are our recommendations for processing through state statutes? We don't think it's a great idea to start working on state statutes until you get our Section 106 letter, and here's why. Our work that we do under Section 106 is quite broad. We have a very large, what we call area of potential effects. We're looking at lots of things. And within our findings letter, we're going to provide to you with a basic understanding of what we know is within that bubble, within that area of potential effects that we're looking at. Listed properties, eligible properties, archaeological sites, burials. So you're going to have already, once you get our letter, you're going to already have a basic understanding of what those things are. And our letter will also say it is the responsibility of XYZ County to work with the SHPO on the Historic Sites Act, to work with OSA and MIAC on the Field Archaeology Act and under the Private Cemeteries Act. So our letter is going to kind of provide some base level information, and we really recommend that you wait before contacting SHPO, OSA, or MIAC to take a look at our letter and see what your responsibilities really might be. By doing that, you potentially are going to save some effort down the line or not duplicate work. But you still need to make sure that within your project planning, you have plenty of time for OSA and MIAC review to address recommendations. State Historic Preservation Office has told us that their Section 106 review will likely, not always, but 99% of the time stand in for Minnesota Historic Sites Act and the Field Archaeology Act. They are looking at things because those laws are very similar to the Section 106 process. They are going to basically be returning to us and then have a paragraph within that email that says, this satisfies state statute responsibilities, the landowner and the project proposer's state statute responsibilities under the Historic Sites Act and under Minnesota Field Archaeology Act. So from that perspective, if you wait for our letter, you potentially are cleared through at least one agency without having to do additional work and additional coordination with them. The other recommendation we have is to hire a professional historian or archaeologist to help you through state statute review. So when you're processing our comments and when you are reaching out to OSA and MIAC, if you have significant archaeological sites or burials within your project, and again, if you don't, then you don't have to talk to those agencies. But if you do, what's going to happen is they're going to review your project plans and come back with recommendations. And those lists of recommendations are recommendations, and you need to decide at your level if you're going to implement those recommendations and what are the downfalls for not doing that. So it could be very, very helpful to have an archaeologist or a historian, depending on the situation, take a look at those recommendations and provide you with the next best course of action. So we very much so recommend that you have an archaeologist on call or somebody that you're contracting with that can help you navigate the world of state statute, especially when it comes to the Minnesota Field Archaeology Act and the Private Cemeteries Act. Just a reminder that it is your responsibility to understand and comply with these state statutes. They're there for a reason. Make sure you understand the coordination and consultation that goes into the process with MnSHPA, OSA, and MIAC. It may be worth your while to talk to any legal counsel about what those statutes say. How do you guys, as a local agency, want to apply those statutes? How do you process those recommendations and have a game plan? So we would certainly recommend that you check with your legal counsel about the applicability and how you're going to handle some of this. Dale, anything else you want to add to the recommendations piece?
Yes. One thing I want to highlight is that Section 106 letter is going to be like your early scoping risk assessment document. That's going to tell you, that should be your decision point. And we can have open conversations. A project should schedule a meeting with me and Katie if we need to, because you've flagged some areas of concern. You've looked at it and said, hey, does this project warrant me probably hiring additional, guidance or advice from a historian? We can meet and we can discuss that. And I want to tell people that that should be the case for maybe 5% or less of the projects that are out there. This isn't for every single project that this is going to trigger and this situation is going to occur. The other thing I want to point out real quick, I see that there's a hand up, so I'll respect that in a second. Hold on. The other thing I want to point out is that there are systems in place currently for a project to hire a historian or get archaeological resourcing through CRU. That may not always be the case moving forward. I will also say that in the 2 years that I've been in the current position with SALT, that program has run out of money on a couple occasions. And when it does, unfortunately, that creates a different lag in being able to secure somebody under contract. We have different, options that are available. But again, the project is still on the hook for producing, the archaeologic investigation that may need to take place or getting that additional guidance and expertise. Again, those are situations that we can talk about, but I wanted to make you aware at a high level that there's some avenues and use the document as a risk assessment document. With that said, I think John Bradford has a quick question.
I do, thank you. I see a lot of language here about coordinating, consulting, and recommendations. If there is a disagreement between the parties or have differing recommendations, or the local agency or the funding agency have different takes on the recommendations, who has the authority to actually mandate action?
Yeah, it's a really good question, John.
Great question.
Yeah, so under the Historic Sites Act, there is actually pretty clear direction that if there's a dispute, there's a committee and then it goes up to the governor's level. The AG's office helps make those decisions and resolve that dispute. There's not dispute resolution language in the Minnesota Field Archaeology Act or the Private Cemeteries Act. That is sort of a wish list item from our unit to have those state statutes revised, but it's not something that is right now in place. What we always recommend is that you work with OSA and you work with MIAC as closely as possible, but it ultimately is up to you guys to decide what recommendations, and again, the word in the statute is recommendations, which recommendations you take forward and then provide justification for that. There is a trick within the Private Cemeteries Act with the new revision to the law. There are felony clauses. So there is language in there that now that you know that there's a burial ground, and if you actively choose to destroy it rather than avoid it or change your project plans, MIAC could come and serve you with a felony. We have not seen that happen. We don't know how that would work because that statute just was changed here basically a year ago, and there hasn't been good guidance that has been developed by the Indian Affairs Council to help us work through those disputes. So again, I think it's really great for you. I would certainly recommend that you talk to legal counsel just to see, okay, hypothetically, what happens if we do this, and what's the legal what are the legal next steps if we disagree. But it's always good to just have those conversations. MIAC and OSA staff are very rational. They're very kind. They're there to help you understand your legal representation and also really help you work through your project. They're going to make some suggestions, and if it works for your project, certainly take those.
And John, that's part of the reason for the webinar is that the state statutes are pretty clear on who's responsible. And while in the past, CRU has been great about coordinating and clearing a lot of these things in the past, a reflection of who's responsible and how to take authority over different things have led to maybe this change in service, if you want to call it that, or way of kind of clarifying who's responsible. We don't want to abandon projects. We want to provide that risk assessment. We want to provide that guidance, but there's a responsibility element to this that does now have legal connotations to it. And so that's why you do see, and rightfully pointing out, what are the responsibilities and should you consult with, legal counsel? We want to help, we want to give advice, but we can't be responsible for those, interactions anymore like maybe we used to. So that's part of why this importance of the webinar.
Thank you.
And another example of, you could look out into a field and see nothing, but this is actually a historic site. Katie, you want to, as I cannot pronounce it.
Oh, the Birch Coulee battlefield, yeah. But it's a great point, especially for archaeological sites. They are everywhere and you don't see them on the landscape. Even burial mounds, sometimes to the untrained eye, they look like just little hills, and they might not even look like hills. And those are actually like burial areas or significant archaeological sites with funerary items or other culturally sensitive items within there. And that's, something that is really important to respect. Okay, so really high level, this is the 10,000 foot level. This is not going to cover every project. And like Dale mentioned, the majority of projects, especially from a 106 perspective, have a no historic properties affected finding. So the majority of the projects that we look at, there isn't any archaeological concern. There are no architecture history concerns under state statutes. And so a lot of these will just get cleared through the process. You won't have extra work to do. But when there is a significant archaeological site or a burial site, or there's something that the SHPO wants more consultation on, that's where it's sort of going to be more work and more consultation on the back end. So Dale and I put together a process timeline. Keep in mind that, again, 10,000 foot level, this is going to apply to some projects, but not all projects. And we're not going to be able to cover every single offshoot you would do this here, but it gives us a sense of just overall what's the process. So like Dale mentioned, you're going to submit your E&M or your cultural noise and threatened and endangered species review request, either taking the document off of the SALT website. Our CRU website also has a link to that document as well. Like we mentioned, and Dale has mentioned, and I know it's been noted everywhere. If we could get 2 field seasons to do our work, that would be ideal, and here's why. Archaeology can only take place in between the months of typically April and October. The last year was a fluky year. Archaeologists were out there all year long because there was no winter, but typically we have a very short field season. And if we cannot get that work done within that field season, we need to move to the next field season. So it's hard. There are solutions within the winter, but they're very, very expensive, where people are using microwaves to warm up the ground. They're using buckets of hot water. They're, physically tenting things, and it can become very, very expensive to do archaeology in the winter. So please, 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 if your project can allow it, please allow 2 field seasons to handle archaeology. Okay, so we
Real
get the
quick.
request. Yeah, go ahead.
Real quickly, Katie. I know that not all projects have the convenience of 2 field seasons because sometimes you're getting federal money thrown at you last minute. If you're hesitant about accepting it, schedule a meeting with me. I'll get CRU on the line and we can talk about levels of risk of whether or not archaeology will be required or not. So we can at least have that initial conversation before you've committed to a project to see if there is a level of risk that you're willing to take to move forward. So that's just one real quick note.
Perfect. Okay, so you submit that request, it goes to the CRU inbox. We start processing it. We take about 60 days to just do the intake, and that intake process includes reaching out to TIPOs, looking at different databases and different fields of information that we have that aren't available to the public, taking a look at the project plans and making some recommendations. And again, remember, when we are looking at a review, it's a Section 106 review. We are not reviewing for state statutes because you guys are the project proposers, and 99% of the time, you guys are also the landowners. If MnDOT intersection, like there's work occurring on a trunk highway and then continues on into the local area. So it's your project, but there's a little intersection with MnDOT. We will do state statute review on that part that is on MnDOT right of way. But the rest of it, we're going to leave out of our findings letter. So we do that review. We might need to do investigation for Section 106 to know if there are eligible sites involved. Remember, Section 106 is much broader. It provides oversight over eligible and listed sites and state statute and historic sites on the state level. So we're looking at a lot of different things. Like we mentioned, 2 field seasons if we can, just to make sure we can address any archaeological or architecture history sites. So once we've gotten through our review, we send our review to the State Historic Preservation Office because they review for Section 106. We do not send to OSA or MIAC unless there is a significant archaeological site that would be covered under our Section 106 review. So our SHPO review typically is about 30 days long. They provide a recommendation back to us, a concurrence letter back to us. And in that concurrence letter, it's going to talk about the Section 106 responsibilities, the federal responsibilities, and they are also going to provide a statement back that, again, 99% of the time is going to say, we looked at this under Section 106. We also looked at this under Minnesota Historic Sites Act and the Field Archaeology Act. So from a SHPO perspective, you will likely be cleared for your project there. But that does not mean that you are cleared through OSA and MIAC. So your next step, if you have significant archaeological sites and or burials, you are going to talk to OSA. If you have none of those, you read through our letter and the letter says there are no known archaeological sites within the project area, there are no known burials within the project area, you are done. You're good to go. You have your SHPO clearance, and then you have you don't have to talk to MIAC or OSA because state statute would not apply. But if you do, if there are archaeological sites or there are known burials, you'll need to talk to OSA or MIAC or both. And here's where we're recommending that you send one letter with both addressee or a letter to each individual group, copying the other. And they need to know that you guys are coordinating back and forth. So you'd submit your plans to OSA and ask for a 30-day review. You'd submit your plans to MIAC, ask for a 45-day review, copy the alternate agency on that so that you know that you're coordinating with both, and wait for recommendations back. They'll take 30 to 45 days to do that review and send back recommendations if they have any. If you do get recommendations back, this is where we would certainly highly recommend that you talk to an archaeologist just to make sure that they are aware of, what's going on and can provide you with some good feedback. So that would be the next step, right, Dale? We've gotten our
Yep,
You
that's
receive,
the
yep, receive comments, and then you have those discussions. So let's say OSA comes back and says, we would really recommend phase 1, which is the investigation for archaeology in this area. And based on the Section 106 review, maybe we did all of that already. Maybe we haven't. Maybe they're recommending they're recommending monitoring, having an archaeologist out there to monitor the construction work. And that's where you'd have that conversation with your archaeologist and with OSA or MIAC and say, okay, we think this is necessary, or no, actually our project really only touches the corner of a suspected archaeological site. So we really don't need to do that. And you have that conversation, that dialogue with them. You resolve your comments, and then you implement your project.
A specific example I wanted to highlight of that interaction, and John, you brought it up earlier, is that, so I had a project request from the city of St. Peter. They had been flagged by MIAC because they had a project that was in vicinity of a known treaty kind of site that was exchanged during the Dakota Wars. And so MIAC had said, wait a minute, you're doing some excavations in a close proximity to where we believe this other site is. We want to review the plans and everything. Well, the reality of what their plans were doing was they were replacing sidewalk along a boulevard. And so that's where kind of some engineering judgment, communication, coordination needs to take place of like, well, this excavation is in a previous excavation site that's only going down a foot to get the existing grade and aggregate, out and then replace. Like, there's some back and forth that does need to occur. And that's where a project needs to kind of make a determination of, how do I respond back to a comment saying, wait a minute, I have an excavation, but yes, that excavation is a limited excavation. And that's where that conversation really helps. And you need to kind of determine whether or not there's any risk associated with that decision too, if you want to say, thanks for your comment, but we're going to move ahead.
And then artfully put in the background is one of our last state historic sites, which is the Memorial Park Burial Grounds in Shakopee. So an actual burial area.
All right. And with that said, we're going to open it up to any questions. Anybody have any questions, concerns, thoughts? Like I said, I'll be. Oh, go ahead, John.
This is John again. I do, but I would actually rather if I could just call one of you at some point and ask your thoughts on a couple of specific things that I don't really want to share with the entire group.
Sure. Yeah, if there's project specific concerns, absolutely reach out to me. I'll schedule something. I have access to Katie's work calendar, and we'll find a time where we can, huddle together and discuss in private. Absolutely. The intent
thank you so much.
The intent of the question is that 10,000 foot high level, in case people had, concerns about this kind of shift. What I don't want to have happen, absolutely do not want to have happen, is that city and county engineers receive this Section 106 letter, which completely discloses that there's 3 Minnesota state statutes that you should be aware of. And then you move forward with your project unaware that you've been made aware of these state statutes. And then all of a sudden your project runs afoul. And now that we're being told that there is a penalty to this, if you disregard some of these statutes, you can't claim that I didn't know, because the environmental responses that you're getting back have outlined that you should be aware of these. That's my personal, take on all this, is I want to make sure that my clients, the city and county engineers, understand what's going on, and we help you guys navigate this the easiest fashion possible. Amber, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I was curious when we could expect this webinar recording to be posted. And before, you mentioned that you would be sending a document with some of the website URLs that you mentioned during the presentation. When could we expect that information?
I'm hoping to work with Alyssa in our state aid office to put that up on our website tomorrow. So what you're going to see is you're going to see several links. You're going to see a link to the saved location of the video where you can watch it. I believe we upload it to YouTube, so you can watch it on YouTube. And then there'll be several links below. For example, we term it a one-pager. I think it was actually more 4 or 5 pages. And Katie was the one that had authored it, and then that includes a lot of the links that she was talking about. And so then I'll put that resource up there. If there's some links specifically that we had mentioned in this video, like the OSA website, I just want to make sure that it's actually in the one pager. I'm pretty sure it is, but if it's not, then I will detail out additional links on the website. And then I'm going to send out a copy of the link to the SALT website so you can have access to those various links in the CEM and the county email and the city email that I sent the meeting notification out for. So then at that point, you will know that the website is up and you'll have access to the video and the various resources.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep. John?
Yes, thanks. On that slide, you have kind of a flow chart of beginning to end of the progress. Can you talk a little bit about the time frames for each of those steps? I know you mentioned a 30-day review and a 45-day review and 2 seasons, but overall, if you go through this process and you have an easy, no conflict kind of project, what time is that? And if you have a complicated, long time frame, what kind of time frame is that?
Yeah, John, good question. So if it's a project that has no complications, no listed National Register sites, no state sites, no archaeology concerns, no cemetery concerns, you're looking at about a 60-day review. We will get you a letter back in 60 days from the moment that you submit something. If it is something where we need to go out and do some kind of investigation, whether for architecture history or archaeology, it's probably going to take us about a year to do. Sometimes faster. It kind of depends on the scale of the project, the scale of the site, the scale of getting up to speed, like getting a contractor on board. As you know, the contracting for local projects can be very tricky. We've got that 80-20 split money that Dale mentioned. It's a very limited pot of money, so we run out of that pretty quickly. We also have some what we call technical assistance contracts that have state aid money applied to them, so we can send a contractor out very quickly without needing to do any contracting. But those buckets of money are also very small. So we get kind of, especially if things come in a little bit later in the season, like in the fall, you probably aren't going to get archaeology done until the next spring. Because we're out of money, and then also the field season is a little bit different. So it kind of depends on where the project is, the resources that are impacted, and then where we are within the flow of available consultants, available pots of money. You can, as a local agency, can hire an archaeologist to go do that work too. You don't need to rely on our money, the MnDOT money. So that is also an option. We will certainly tell you that. We'll say, hey, we're out of our set aside money to be able to help you through 80-20 split. We don't have any contractor money left. You need to go out and do this yourself. Here's a list of archaeologists that you can take a look at and hire somebody to go out and do this investigation. They send us the information and their reports, and then we do our finding. So, you know, if it's a really complicated project, it can take a year or more. And then that's just to get through the Section 106, probably a year to get through Section 106. And then you've got that additional OSA MIAC review and recommendation piece of it, which they have, let's just say 45 days to review. That's a month and a half. And then if you want to resolve any issues or questions, it's probably another month after that before you really can get started. So it's really project dependent. And I apologize, I don't have like a more specific concrete timeline for you, but it really kind of depends on the scale scope of the undertaking.
And that's why we wanted to highlight that CRU Section 106 review and that letter really is that risk assessment phase that we want to sit down and we want to discuss with you so that you're aware of what options are moving forward and so that you can best manage your project. I will also say that there was another project, I want to say it was in northern Minnesota, I can't remember exact location, but they were going to result in an archaeological investigation, but we had talked that, hey, wait a minute, there's this water main installation from a previous project that had taken place, and as long as they had put their trail over top that easement area, it resulted in no need for an archaeological investigation. So there are some things that we can look at project specific that may be able to eliminate archaeological investigations such that we can streamline the effort moving forward. Because keep in mind, this is really this longer time frame is really going to result in maybe 5% of the program, and hopefully the tails of having to talk to OSA and MIAC are the exception, the 1%. And vast majority of the projects are going to have the no issue and just file it in their files and move forward. So that's the hope. But again, that first section review, we're hoping to have dialogue back and forth and provide that guidance so you can make a determination. Can I avoid it? Do I have to hire an archaeologist? Do I have other ways of addressing this? So that's the best spot to have that conversation to address your timeline and risk.
And I might just say, John, just there's sort of an in-between one, like if there is Minnesota Historic Sites Act issues or Field Archaeology Act issues, or things that are easy to resolve within that SHPO Section 106 review. So we take about 60 days to do our review. If we send it over to SHPO, it's another 30 days for review and comment. So, you know, it's a 3-month, 4-month process if you've got like a Historic Sites Act situation going on.
And this is all leading to why I want to get certain work types excluded from these reviews, by the way, so that we can allocate resources and time to these projects that actually deserve a detailed review. That's just my soapbox item, sorry. Jeffrey, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both very much for presenting a very good, interesting topic and a lot of good information. You spoke earlier, Dale, about the St. Peter project, and I was curious when it comes to that, the area of potential impact. If if the information that you have, or MIAC has, or whoever has, it's GIS based. For instance, maybe it's a burial mound. If you got a project that's a sidewalk that's going by the burial mound, let's say it's 50 feet away or 100 feet away or whatever, being that, with the area of potential impact, and would that require then all this other additional, like archaeological phase 1 still be completed, even though it's in the vicinity of a known site?
Potentially, yes. And that might happen under that Section 106 review. If it doesn't happen within the 106 review, what you're going to probably get back from MIAC at that time is a recommendation for like monitoring the work, or being, a lot of times for archaeology, we actually don't want to do investigation because it disturbs sites, especially if we know of them. So like if it is a known burial site, the recommendation from an archaeologist isn't actually to go out and do any investigation. It would be to avoid it or to try to find ways to minimize a potential effect. So what might happen is that the recommendation from MIAC is to monitor the project in that particular location. That's just that stretch that's adjacent to a burial site, to make sure that there are no human remains that are uncovered. And in that case, you would work with MIAC to do that. And it would be the responsibility of the local agency to provide, funding to hire that tribal monitor or hire an archaeologist to be out there, because it's not really a Section 106 issue.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right, I got 2 comments in the chat, Katie. First one
Yep.
from Ryan. Could you provide a high-level overview of the process when working on sensitive sites within historic reservation boundaries, but not on tribal lands? Who ultimately has final say and oversight?
Yeah. Okay. So really tricky. We're getting kind of deep into the weeds on this one. So if it is a project that is working within reservation boundaries, well, if it's in with reservation boundaries, it would be technically tribal land. So any ceded land and reservation boundaries would be something that the TIPO then would review, not the SHPO. But same type of process. We have Section 106 agreements with 7 of the 11 tribes. Where we walk through, we have like an expedited or a streamlined process. For those tribes that we don't have a Section 106 standalone agreement with them, we just follow the regular regulation. And they have 30 days to respond. We do have some TIPOs and SHPOs that actually have split review. So SHPO will take a look at the architecture history piece of it, and the TIPO will take a look at the archaeology. Still that 30-day review process. Recommendations come in to us from a 106 perspective, and then we would implement those or not. If it is something that ends up being more of a state statute issue, it's not falling under Section 106, Private Cemeteries Act type of thing, MIAC is still your point person, even if it is on reservation boundaries, but that MIAC will be talking to the TIPO very, very closely and seeing what the TIPO would like to do in that situation. Does that help, Ryan?
Yeah, that does help. I guess I don't know the nuance with, not every reservation in Minnesota is a closed reservation. There are several reservations that have a lot of private land and public land within the historic boundary type of thing, and it gets a little bit tricky in some areas on who has ultimate oversight.
Yeah, state statute, it talks about ceded land and tribal land and reservation land and treaty land. So it does sort of encompass all of those little bits and pieces that aren't necessarily within the bounds of a box, that has been drawn on the map. So that would still, MIAC would be your regulator in that case, and they would be working with the TIPOs. And then it looks like we've got steps for city county should take for non-federal projects or what there is a nexus with a core permit. Good question. So if you're not using FHWA money, you're working with those agencies directly. So you're not working with CRU. So let's say you have a project and it needs a core permit and there's no FHWA funding on it. You would then contact the USACE directly, and then that group would do the Section 106 review for you, but you're still responsible for state statute review. So we might not have quite the same level of guidance for you, but it's going to be very similar that agency is going to do your Section 106 review. Probably should wait for their review to be done before you contact OSA and MIAC for any concerns, but you could talk to those agencies directly and say, hey, do you want me to wait? Can I go ahead and start talking to some other agency for my state statute responsibilities and see what they say?
And then Katie, Mark just asked, if we're working in a state park, is it okay to allow MnDOT archaeologists to coordinate with MIAC and SHPO to meet the state statute requirements? Well, go ahead.
Oh yeah, if you want to take it, Dale, I'm happy to not talk.
Correct me if I'm wrong here on this one then, Katie. Because the statute does define who is the responsible entity, if the city or project proposer or county for that matter wants to delegate their coordination to another entity, that's a risk assessment item because the statute is pretty clear about who's responsible for doing what action. So you could do that, Mark. It depends upon what risk level or tolerance you're comfortable with. But ultimately, the statute's clear about who's responsible.
Right. And if it's on a state park, DNR archaeologists are going to talk to us if there's federal funding, like let the action within the park is federally funded, a federal grant, an FHWA grant. We would do the Section 106 review. If there aren't any grant monies that have federal FHWA hooks to them, then the project proposer is still responsible for the Historic Sites Act, but the DNR would be responsible for Field Archaeology and Private Cemeteries Act. So you would just coordinate with them. Typically, there's one letter sent out because SHPO also is part of the Field Archaeology Act that it would cover the Historic Sites Act too. That content in the letter. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, it does.
It's a flow chart in my brain. The flow chart is who's funding it, who's proposing it, who's got the land. Those are the three things, and I've got a whole tentacle of things that I'm thinking about when I see a project. So we all get there eventually.
We have time for one more question before I have to end the meeting because we're here up against the meeting time. All right, we got another one. Is there a way to check on the review status after the initial submittal? If no communication or issues brought up from request form, is it okay to assume no news is good news?
Yeah, I would say you're going to still have to wait for our clearance letter from a Section 106 perspective. You'll get that in the email. If it's a no historic properties affected finding, it'll be an attachment to a document coming back to you or whomever sent us the NM. But typically, if we're working through our 60-day process and you're not hearing anything from us, you're not hearing us say, hey, we need more information about this, or hey, I've got concerns about archaeological sites. We're probably going to need an archaeologist to go out and do some investigation. If you're not hearing any of that, it probably means that there really are very limited concerns that you're just going to have to wait for the letter to come back. And then I do just quick plug, when you're submitting for a project, always go get a new letter template from Dale's SALT website or the CRU website. We do make tweaks to those because we find that actually we're missing a piece of information consistently. So we'll change the letter template to ask for that directly. So please just always go grab a new letter template when you're working. Don't use something old.
And if there's a concern because of timeline on your project, send me an email and I can coordinate with CRU and get a response back to you about what's the status and what their concerns are if you haven't heard anything. I have done that time and time again over the last 2 years for specific projects that are up against the wall. So feel free to reach out to me. There are those various statutory review periods where if they exceed them, then you're fine. You can move forward. But there's other times where maybe there's something going on in the background, like Katie said about investigating whether or not an archaeological site needs to be reviewed, and they're going in-depth review, and maybe that could facilitate a conversation that maybe we can avoid it and save everyone some time if a project's willing to change some scope. So definitely just send me an email and reach out. And then we'll take this last question from Stefan. Is the 60-day period calendar or working days?
Typically calendar days. Do know that our staff are super overloaded like everybody's staff are. So we're trying to get to projects as quickly as we can. So look for about 60 calendar days. If we need more time, we will likely let you know that. If you don't get a response at 60 days, please reach out to Dale or the CRU inbox and we'll be sure to respond.
All right. With that said, I want to thank everyone for attending. I think our attendance high was around 110 at one point, so that's a really good turnout. Again, I will be sending out an email with links to the presentation and additional resources. And I want to thank Katie for taking the time to come and talk and answer questions. I really do appreciate it. Her staff is really overworked with all of the program that they are looking at, both for federal program and for the state for that matter. So I do appreciate carving out the time to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
That's it. Take care, and I'm going to stop the recording.